Well, hello, good afternoon, and welcome to City Futures Research Centre seminar series. I'm Dr. Richard Billingsley. Today's seminar is being held on the traditional land of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respect to the elders past and present, especially to any First Nations people joining us today. In a moment, I will be introducing Dr. Hazel Easthope. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. If you're joining online, please mute your microphone and turn off your camera during the presentation. Then when we get to Q&A, if you'd like to turn these back on, you're very welcome to. You can also put a question into the chat, and my associate Adi, she'll be monitoring the chat for questions. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Hazel Easthope. She's the Deputy Director of City Futures, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Richard. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you today to Dr. Charlie Gillon, who led the project that he's going to be presenting to you today. Some of you may have read about it in the Sydney Morning Herald earlier this week. It was a project for the government architect, New South Wales, trying to explore what people who are purchasing apartments in New South Wales would like. Sorry, there was some giggles because I think, is it Bill? On the screen, very large. Thanks, Bill, for turning off your camera. What people...
Oh, it's Big Brother watching.
Purchasing apartments in New South Wales actually want to buy, what they want to see in their apartments. So the findings are super interesting. And without further ado, I'll pass you on to Charlie to talk us through them.
Thank you very much, Hazel. Thanks to all who have joined in the room and online. So I'm going to share some insights and outcomes from a piece of contract research that was undertaken for the Government Architect New South Wales in mid-2023, which was conducted with my colleague, Professor Hazel Easthope. Before I get started, I'd also like to acknowledge the Bidjigal people who are the traditional custodians of the land where I'm presenting from today. Pay my respect to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today in Randwick. I'd also like to acknowledge that the apartment photographs that were taken in this presentation were taken on Dharawal country in my hometown of Wollongong, a city with its own past, present, and future relationships with apartment living. Just a quick presentation outline. So I'll give you a bit of an introduction and background into the research. Then I'll summarize what we found, both using a survey instrument and some follow-up interviews, some closing reflections on key findings, which I hope to frame the discussion that we have, and then some time for questions. So part one, project background and methods. So much attention has been given to questions of medium to high density living and housing supply discussions in New South Wales and nationally, but there's little information available about the types of buildings with regard to scale and form that apartment purchasers prefer and why. This research set out to investigate exactly that, how different types of apartment buildings are perceived by apartment purchasers with a focus on perceptions of building form, size, scale, and age. A lot of the time when we have these conversations, the focus is on the apartment itself and not on the building. So we really wanted to start to understand what's happening with perceptions at the market for apartment buildings. Broadly, the what and where of new apartment stock tends to be apartment towers and large apartment complexes currently, where planning regulations allow for such density. So we're seeing compact city planning logics, which has been referred to as the orthodoxy of planning in Australia currently for its major cities, creating the conditions for medium to high density, particularly high rise. Colleagues at City Futures have spoken about urban renewal and the need for more variegated responses. So understanding that density has lots of different forms and formats, and it's not just high rise. There's lots in the broad umbrella of density that we can start to bring into urban renewal conversations. Learning more about the purchaser decisions, the who and the why made by recent apartment purchasers can help to assess whether current apartment supply is capturing the motivations, the needs and preferences of a variety of different purchaser profiles, which accounts for differences in lifestyle, life stage and family composition. Some colleagues at RMIT have been working on apartments and high-rise development in Melbourne, saying pitch apartments are apartments the new Australian dream. And it's, we're starting to see different conversations that are happening around the supply that's being brought online in the market and what options are available to people at point of purchase. So broadly on project context, so this project was really aiming to look at the consumer side. So consumer side priorities of medium to high density living in New South Wales focusing on the experiences of recent apartment purchases, which we defined as those who purchased an apartment in the last 10 years, so from 2013 to 2023. This research was funded by the Government Architect New South Wales, and we used two methods to investigate the preferences and perceptions of recent purchases. Firstly, a New South Wales-wide survey of apartment purchases, and we received 260 responses, 210 of which were owner-occupiers. We also conducted follow-up interviews with a subset of surveyed apartment purchases, 17 of which were owner-occupiers. So we focus the findings of this report on the preferences and experiences of owner-occupiers due to the sample that we're able to collect, which is a really interesting sample because quite often in housing debates, we're hearing a lot about apartments being built for the investor market, so investor owners with renters making up a higher proportion of people who live in apartments. Approximately 30% of apartments in New South Wales are owner-occupied, and we were able to here tighten the focus on owner-occupiers, which is valuable because it shows the priorities of purchasers that are buying an apartment to live in. Just broadly on the timeline for the project, so it ran from March to July of 2023. The survey was open for 6 weeks between June and July, and then there were follow-up interviews that were recorded over roughly a month. With some interviews conducted, analysis, and then finalisation of the project in August. Just noting that the preferences of investor owners were not reported on in the study just due to the available collective data we were able to collect during the research window. Of course, a focus on investor owner preferences would be beneficial for future research. You can now access the full results report. It's online. It was put online this afternoon. So it's available. I'd encourage you to have a look at it because I'm going to talk about some of the report that, of course, cannot capture all of it in the time that I've got for you this afternoon. So moving on to survey results. So what we asked, we split the survey into 3 themes. So firstly, pre-purchase preferences. Secondly, the selection of building scheme features. And lastly, post-purchase reflections. So we're really interested in what happened when people were looking for an apartment, how they selected between options that they may have shortlisted at the time. And then once they purchased, what did they find once they moved in? Maybe what did they consider in hindsight? I'll present some of the things that we found there as well. In terms of pre-purchase preferences, we asked those preferences on 3 different attributes. Firstly, size by preferred number of apartments. Secondly, age by preferred building age. And thirdly, type, so by preferred building type. You'll see a nice set of graphics along the bottom of this slide. These build on the typologies of apartment buildings that were outlined in the 2021 Draft Apartment Design Guide by the Department of Planning, with the addition of a 7th typology of tower complex apartments, which was provided by the Government Architect just to give us the full suite of the options available in terms of bulk or on site. These were a really useful proxy to help participants categorize the type of buildings that they were looking for. It's quite difficult in a survey without a visual element to ask people the kinds of buildings that they were looking for. So they were very useful for our purposes. On post-purchase reflections, we were focused on 4 things. Firstly, what type of building that they purchased and why they did that, that they purchased into. Second, were buyers able to find what they were looking for? Third, were they satisfied with their purchase and why? And lastly, in hindsight, was there anything that they would have considered about purchasing an apartment or purchasing that particular apartment that they wished they had considered before they bought? I'd also just like to share some quick insights to help paint a picture of the sample of owner-occupiers that we were able to collect. So we got a very informed and experienced sample in terms of purchasing property, skewing older towards family formation, mid-career and downsizing. This was quite commonly not someone's first residential purchase. So for 6 in 10 owners, this was not their first residential purchase. Recent purchases, 4 in 10 had purchased in the last 4 years of the study, so between 2020 and 2023. In terms of the where, largely captures Greater Sydney, so almost 9 in 10 of the people that we surveyed, but this is representative of where apartments are currently in New South Wales. Specifically, if you know the geography of Sydney, the Eastern City and the North Districts were the bulk of where we got our sample from. It's also important to note that these characteristics of owner-occupiers and their buildings surveyed are representative of owner-occupied apartment households in New South Wales by location, by age, by household composition, and by the number of stories in buildings, which gave us confidence that we were able to get a useful sample. Something about building types I'd just like to quickly note as well. 8 in 10 of our survey participants lived in what we've classed as mid-rise, so fewer than 9 stories. I'd also just like to talk about the sample based on the recruitment channels that we would use to advertise the survey. So we were lucky enough to have the support of both the Strata Community Association and the Owners Corporation Network, the Flat Chat column in the Australian Financial Review, the City of Sydney Apartment Owners Network, and also our own social media channels, so LinkedIn and Twitter that we used. Due to these channels, the survey participants that we were able to get may be more informed and more aware about building and development, building quality, and some of the strata governance challenges that the general population faces. So we've captured some informed owners here, also some built environment professionals potentially. So I'm going to talk through the 3 themes, and for each theme, I'm going to show a key findings slide and an in-focus slide that looks more closely at one of the findings. So firstly, in terms of pre-purchase preferences, we asked survey participants about their preferences before purchasing in relation to building type, size, and age. For these questions, the participants were able to choose more than one option from the presented options. So the results are reported as the percentage of all participant responses. I'm just going to go through some of the headline findings here. So firstly, participants were more attracted to medium-rise apartment building types, which included row apartment buildings, infill apartment buildings, and courtyard apartments. This compares to 17.1% of participants that were looking for an apartment in a tower. Participants also preferred buildings with fewer apartments. The most common responses selected were less than 10 apartments and 10 to 19 apartments. The reasons for these size preferences were related to benefits of living in smaller buildings. So things that people cited were the greater sense of community that they were able to have in a smaller building, small strata schemes being easy to manage, and having less of those big ticket items to maintain. So things such as lifts and pools were mentioned. The building age preferences pre-purchase were more varied. They were split between new, middle-aged, and older buildings. For those who preferred something newer, so within sort of the last 5 years, the most common reasons included modern design, amenities and finishes, maintenance and repair costs in older buildings that people were wary of, and wanting something brand new to be the first person to move into an apartment and have that be your the first person to live there. Common reasons for preferring older buildings included the perception that older buildings have better construction quality, the building being old enough that issues are known and resolved, and concern about the risk of defects in new buildings. So I'm just going to show here, based on what we were able to collect, that owner-occupiers were more likely to be attracted to apartments in medium-rise building types. So here, just showing the different types that we asked people about. Courtyard apartment buildings, row apartments, and narrow infill were the most likely to be selected. And as I said, survey participants were less attracted to high-rise building types, being tower apartments and tower complexes towards the end of the typology that we presented. In terms of selection, survey participants were presented with a series of options that were related to the relative importance of different building design features, and whether they considered a series of other factors about the building's strata scheme before purchasing. The number of stories, the materials used, and the number of apartments were considered by owner-occupier survey participants as the most important apartment building design features from the provided options. Features that were considered less important were indoor communal spaces and facilities for residents. The most likely other scheme aspects to be considered by surveyed owner-occupiers from the options were the kinds of information provided by pre-purchase strata reports and building reports, which is a good sign that people are doing those things. So maintenance and repair, strata fees, and the financial health of the strata scheme. So the things that you're likely to see when you're getting those reports commissioned before purchasing. Aspects that were less likely to be considered from the options provided were the balance of owner-occupiers and investor owners, the life of the building, and the size of the strata scheme. And just focusing here on the importance of building design features. So the number of stories, the materials used, and the number of apartments were considered as the most important building design features from the presented options. You'll see here all the options that we asked. These features that we chose to ask were discussed in conversation with the government architect. because they're the ones that we wanted to focus on around not apartment design features, but building design features for this survey. Accessibility features and outdoor communal spaces were also important. Indoor communal spaces and resident facilities were less important features for survey participants. We also collected responses, so people were given an option to ask to provide an option for other. So if they wanted to write a response for features that we didn't capture. What was interesting here is that people diverted to talk about different apartment features. So even though they were asked to talk about the building, apartment design is still core to how people are making decisions. So things like aspect and outlook, apartment layout and design, including cross ventilation and solar access, location of the apartment, whether the apartment was low maintenance, and proximity to transport and services. So the third theme of the survey was post-purchase reflections. When asked why they bought their apartment, preferred location, apartment layout and size, and outlook and aspect were the most important reasons that were mentioned by owner-occupiers. Other reasons mentioned included affordability, price being within budget, building form and layout, and access to green space. Of the survey, of the sample that we were able to collect, almost 6 in 10 of our survey participants purchased into medium-rise apartment building types. So here, narrow infill, courtyard, and row apartment buildings comprise 56.3% of the apartments that were purchased. Something else that was always also very encouraging was from the survey sample, 8 in 10 owner-occupiers reported that they were able to buy the type of apartment that they were looking for. So 31% strongly agreed, 51% agreed. So not all ecstatic, but certainly very happy with what they were able to buy. 8 in 10 owner-occupiers reported that they were satisfied with their purchase. The most mentioned reasons for being satisfied were related to apartment location, that the apartment met their criteria and needs, that the satisfaction with apartment design and layout after moving in, and that the scheme was being well maintained and managed. So what we're seeing here is that while 8 in 10 people were able to find what they were looking for, and that 8 in 10 were satisfied with their purchase, there is a sizable minority that were not satisfied. So here we've got 2 in 10 that were not satisfied with the apartment that they're living in. So yeah, that gives us some pause. The most mentioned reasons that owners were unsatisfied included governance difficulties, the presence of building defects, and apartment design features not being ideal once in place. So thinking you were buying into something, then getting there and realizing that it didn't suit your needs, or that what you were expecting wasn't what you ended up living in. So I'd just like to focus on the building type purchased. And what we did was we compared the building type that was purchased to the preferences that people expressed before purchasing, because we wanted to see the percentage difference between those two things. So almost 6 in 10 survey participants purchased into medium-rise apartment building types, being narrow infill, courtyard, and row apartment buildings. And tower and tower complex buildings accounted for 15.7% of the buildings that were purchased. We then calculated the percentage difference between what people were attracted to and what was purchased to understand that gap, the shortfall between desire and available supply. And we found that the largest shortfall between what people were attracted to and what was purchased was those mid-rise apartments. So for row apartments, courtyards, and perimeter block apartments, which suggests, that maybe there's some more matching up that can be done around what's available on the market and affordable at the time. I'd just like to focus as well on what people spoke about in hindsight. So what we did with we asked people some short open response questions in the survey. One of these was the hindsight question here. We took the responses that was given and we coded them in a software program called NVivo by the number of mentions, and then thematically coded them to get what we saw were the top 8 responses, the things that people wish that they had considered before purchasing. So the top 8 responses that we were able to capture, the first one overwhelmingly was challenges of living in strata, which includes here things like interpersonal issues with the strata committee, decision-making processes, fees and levies, and making adjustments to living in strata. Several of the people that we were able to capture spoke about this being the first time that they'd ever lived in an apartment building, and the amount of awareness that these purchasers had of being part of a strata scheme varied across the sample. Second, again, despite the fact that the survey was focused on apartment buildings, the design of the apartments, of course, came in as well. So aspects of apartment design, including acoustics, parking, and storage. Construction quality and building defects came up as well. So several of the open responses that we captured spoke about building defects, some at length about some of the ongoing issues that they've been having, both chasing defects, trying to get things sorted out with the builder, the developer, and in some cases through legal proceedings. People wanted more information before purchasing. Some people said that they would have purchased something else. There were some people that wrote that they would have purchased another apartment. Some people unfortunately had such a difficult experience with strata that they didn't want to be part of a strata scheme if they had to have the choice. But of course, on the other side, a lot of people were content that they had nothing to add. 52 respondents did not give an answer for this question, so they had nothing to add in hindsight, which suggests, that people were in the main. We had a quite satisfied sample, but of course, some things came up in hindsight that people wanted to share with us. Lastly, I'd just like to outline some of the interview insights that we were able to collect and profile the interviewees that we were able to speak with. So regarding the characteristics of the interviews, we designed the interview phase to focus on the specific details and lived experience of purchasing an apartment from a subset of survey respondents. As I said before, we had a really engaged and I guess enthusiastic sample. We had 150 of the 260 respondents put down their email address for being contacted for a follow-up interview. The scope of the project, of course, meant that we couldn't do 150 interviews in the time that we had, but we did manage to do 20. It's quite rare to have such a rich opportunity to do that. So what we did was we built a matrix of different characteristics and tried to get some coverage across those characteristics so that we could have a diverse and varied response of different kinds of owner experiences. Those characteristics were the building type, by the typology that they selected, the owner type, which we lean towards owner-occupiers just based on the survey and what we were able to collect, whether people were satisfied with their purchase, the size of the building, the age of the building, the location, capturing both inner and greater Sydney, the regional centres, which we included here as suburbs in the Central Coast, Illawarra and Hunter, and regional as well. The age of the owners was quite broadly split, and we managed to get parity in terms of the gender of the people we spoke to as well. So these interviews were conducted and facilitated online using Microsoft Teams. Those transcripts were then analysed thematically to draw out key themes and support and build upon what we found in the survey. A selection of the indicative interview quotes from owner-occupiers is used to illustrate the discussion of the themes in this report. I'm going to focus on a couple with the time that I've got today. The rest of the themes are in the report, so I encourage you to have a look at them as well. Sorry, I need to keep bending down. My water bottle's on the floor. So we pulled out 5 key interview insights from just using the owner-occupier samples, which help to reinforce some of the things we found in the survey, but provide more detail about the specific decisions that people were making and how their purchases suited their circumstances. So I'll talk to these briefly and then I'll focus on to the next part of the presentation. So apartment living was a preference across life stage and household composition. So we're seeing people choose an apartment first, to not be settling for an apartment, which is something, of course, that we hear in the media. People are seeking out good, well-located, well-designed apartments. The drivers for living in an apartment include preferred location, proximity to transport and services, the affordances of lifestyle that it allows you to live in a centre around facilities and services, and the convenience that offers as well. Second, some building design features made medium to high density more comfortable. Commonly mentioned features included view and outlook, so having something to look upon, whether that was the view of green spaces that were inside the complex, whether that was a view of nature, whether that just wasn't a view into somebody else's apartment. That was something that came up a lot as well. The separation distance between buildings, so when towers are co-located, to have some separation. When blocks are set, are they built to the boundary, or is there green space around them? The importance of green space was also brought across from the survey into the interviews, for both an outlook, but also as a place to be in, so to have a space for people to access. Third, smaller buildings were chosen for a greater sense of community. So it's sort of like that Friends, that Seinfeld kind of vibe. People wanted to be able to bump into people that they knew. 2/3 of the owners that we interviewed purchased into medium density buildings, and many of them pointed out that they'd chosen that for a greater sense of community. A couple of people spoke about how they felt like larger buildings had more of a hotel feel, that you close your door and not see your neighbours. People were more likely to bump into neighbours, to know their neighbours' names. And some of those design features around, for example, a courtyard, where you're sort of given some design prods, nudges to be in the same spaces and share those spaces. Fourth, building age is associated with building quality. So purchasers were cautious when it came to considering new buildings, which is not surprising considering the media exposure that building quality has been given in the last half decade or so. But it also shows that there's market awareness of the high profile apartment defects that we've seen in New South Wales. So there's a cautious consumer, which is a good thing in some cases. And lastly, we saw that governance risks varied with scheme size. So we were able to speak across a broad and diverse group of people and a broad and diverse group of apartments. People had different perceived risks of buying into smaller or larger schemes, which I'll go into in more detail later in the presentation. So I'm just going to focus on two themes from the interview coding that are really teasing out the interplay between size, scale, and age, and how consumers were justifying their purchase when they spoke to me. It was really interesting to get those perspectives and to also see how those perspectives informed what was purchased. So age emerges as an important factor when purchasers discuss value. Purchasers perceive older buildings to be better quality and were cautious regarding new buildings, citing media coverage and market awareness of high-profile apartment defects. Developer reputation and history were important factors for the uptake of new builds. As a trade-off, older buildings required consideration of existing condition and upcoming maintenance and repair before buying. There were other things around the investment value as well of older buildings, so that capital gains were likely to be larger in older buildings than in newer buildings. So I'm just going to quickly talk to a couple of these quotes. You'll see that I've bolded some things here to bring out in more detail. So firstly, here thinking about some of the timeframes and timelines that people have to rectify defects. I'm glad I went for at least 11 years old, because by that time, if it's a poor build, defects start to show up. Second quote here, that there was a perception that towers were generally, the number of defects that they'd heard about with towers were just too worrying to even consider looking at towers. They bought into a 1980s double brick courtyard apartment. And one of the things that really brought them into that was, they were aware that they needed to upgrade things, but that they would take that over the unknowns of buying into something newer. Third quote here, we just knew that buying a new building, you were taking on as the purchaser an awful lot of risk, and in a way where you weren't protected. So the third quote here, there was some concerns about the conditions for building that had happened over the last 15 to 20 years, and were quite informed before purchasing, having purchased into Strata before. And then lastly here, I guess here to think about the something that came up earlier was that people aren't always looking at older buildings. There's also a real desire for new buildings and new buildings that are built well. So this last quote here, we're not against new apartments, we're just against poorly built newer apartments. So if it was in their price range and they hadn't been able to afford a brand new apartment, they would have gone with something newer if that was allowed, if that was something that they felt confident in. On the last point from themes that we've picked out, governance risks vary with scheme size. So interviewees described how they assess different perceived risks of buying into smaller or larger strata schemes, highlighting things like building condition, build quality, and the crucial role of governance that governance plays in strata schemes. Small schemes were perceived as easier to manage. They have less big ticket items to maintain. So here the first quote, as soon as you have lifts and things like that, your strata fees go up. But of course, there's a trade-off here. If you have a lower scale building, there are no lifts, but it's all stairs. So people are starting to think about what suits them and their lifestyles and their capabilities. Costs are distributed across less people though, and this can require more individual effort from some owners to manage. Having smaller amounts of people to share the work of being on a strata committee, for example, or to be making decisions on behalf of other owners. Larger schemes are seen as more expensive due to maintaining lifts and shared facilities, but they were seen to have an economy of scale and are seen as likely to have multifaceted management of the building. So I'll just bring to a quote here. The cost to rectify something that's wrong with the building split 20 ways is much less if it's split 4 ways or something like that. So people are starting to think about scale and what's available to them, not just for small scale, but also for larger scale. Of course, the larger the building, the larger the problem sometimes. So even though you've got 20, 50 people to share the costs, those costs can be larger. We also heard that people were starting to think about the amount of say that they would have being in a smaller building. So this third quote here, they were speaking about low density and not having lifts and those big ticket features, but also they perceived it as easier to manage being part of a smaller strata committee. So being able to know who's on the committee, being able to share decisions and get things done. And then a quote to sort of juxtapose that point, that a lot of people don't like big blocks, but it gives you the money to outsource your work to professionals, which they saw as a good thing. So governance risks people were aware of them. They varied with the size of the scheme. But it's something that really, when we were looking at the buildings, governance was key to the reasons why people were choosing what they chose. It wasn't just about form and what was built, but it was also about the mechanisms to run those buildings and keep them safe. So I'd just like to finish with 5 closing reflections, and then I'm sure I've got plenty of time for discussion. So firstly, survey participants expressed a preference and demand for mid-rise building types, which invites consideration around how and whether available and upcoming apartment buildings are aligning with these preferences. So starting to think about what's being built and where, and whether people are able to access what they're looking for, and if not, what kind of trade-offs are happening. What do we need to be aware of? What are people compromising on? Whether it's location, whether it's living in a tower, living in a smaller building. There's things that we need to start thinking about and trying to capture those trade-offs. Second, as I mentioned earlier, purchasers are informed and discerning consumers, which is really great. This is a group where the majority were able to purchase what they wanted. This is an engaged set of owners who do their research. So 8 in 10 were able to purchase what they wanted and were satisfied with what they bought. Of course, there was the sizable minority that was not able to buy what they wanted and weren't satisfied, and those shortfalls may lead to more trade-offs and compromises in the future. So people are able to buy what they wanted now. If there are differences in what's available, in the future, maybe those shortfalls will shift. Third, older buildings were associated with purchasing into a quality building, but purchasers are still attracted to newly built buildings. So the preference for older buildings here points to a couple of things. It points to the importance of maintaining existing stock well, but also considering how the desired design features in older buildings can inform supply decisions. So what kinds of features were being sought after in smaller buildings that could perhaps be applied to larger buildings in the way that they're being envisioned. Developer reputation was highlighted as really important for the uptake of new apartment buildings. Again, it's encouraging that there are things like the iCert ratings that are coming online to give consumers the chance to know and have a bit of a sense of what developers' reputation are. So things are becoming more easy to access, which is good. Fourth, owner-occupiers had different views about density and risk, especially when it came to building governance. So the interviews here showed that risks varied with scheme size. So smaller schemes were perceived as easier to manage with less big ticket items, but costs were distributed across less people. Larger schemes are seen as more expensive, but as I said before, they have more of an economy of scale. There's more options available for things like the management of the building and sharing the work or outsourcing the work to professionals. And lastly, governance is really crucial for how satisfied people feel with their apartment purchase. So governance challenges were the most mentioned reason for being unsatisfied after purchase, and challenges with strata governance was the #1 consideration that owners raised in hindsight. So this speaks, I suppose, to the risk that's always inherent in property purchase, and the effective management of risk, particularly in multi-owned apartments, which is an area of further exploration, something that I'd like to take further in the research as this translates from industry and government into academic outputs. So I'll leave the closing reflections up, but I've deliberately gone for plenty of time for questions because I'm looking forward to discussing the work. So thanks very much. And yeah.
So we have about 15 minutes now for some questions. So if anyone has any question or comment, either here or online, please do go ahead.
Charlie, can you show the link again?
Yeah, of course. So it's just on a City Futures project page.
It'll be posted online for the next week.
Yeah. Good question.
Nothing online. Oh, we've got Bill's raised his hand online. Bill?
Don't forget things going. Yeah, look, the missing middle. What does this tell you about the demand for the missing middle? The missing middle being the lower rise, often walk-up housing that certainly the last 15 years, the development industry has really moved away from to concentrate on as tall as they possibly can. Is this a sort of evidence to suggest that the missing middle really is something which people want to live in, and therefore what's the planning system doing to promote this?
Yeah, so we found that there was a real preference. I'm not sure where to look, Bill. I'm just going to look straight ahead. So we found that there was a real preference and demand for mid-rise building types. So things like I might just shoot back to the typology. It might be easy to talk through. So the first 4 typologies here, so narrow infill, row apartments, shop tops, and courtyard apartments, were what we captured as part of what we called mid-rise, so between 4 and 8 stories. So less than 4 and between 4 and 8 were the most common. So there was a real preference for mid-rise, with courtyard, narrow, and row apartments being the most preferred when people were looking for an apartment. So what we found in the survey, it does speak to that desire and demand for mid-rise in the market. As I said, several people, so 6 in 10 people did purchase into that mid-rise form. But the shortfalls that we were starting to observe in terms of the preferences that people had and what they were able to buy, the shortfalls were the largest between those mid-rises. So what we were seeing is there's a preference, people were able to buy in the main a moment for that, but that shortfall, if things aren't being built, so as you suggest, if the missing middle remains missing, there's a chance that there'll be more trade-offs and compromises on what people are looking for in the future. So yeah, it certainly raises questions about what we should be building and where.
Thanks.
I have some questions online. I hope I don't, from Maida, I'm sorry if I said your name incorrectly. They've said, thank you for your research, for presenting your outstanding research. My question is, were any of the apartments you studied build to rent or all were build to sell apartments?
So what we captured were market sales in the main, so market sales and off the plan. So we didn't capture and build to rent in the survey, but it would be a really interesting thing to explore further. So yeah, we were looking at owner-occupier purchase in this case. There is some work in the centre, I think, that's emerging around build to rent. So watch this space and future seminars.
We also have another question from Donald. Donald's asked, did the government architect not want you to assess perceptions of terraced housing / townhouses?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of conversation happening. I'm not going to speak on behalf of the client, but there's the idea was to have a look at what kind of buildings people were looking for. And we started off with the proposition that when density is allowed through planning, so when things like towers and high-rise come online, and they're the things that are built, is this actually what people want? So we were really trying to explore the different and diverse options for density that were available, and the kinds of preferences that maybe aren't being captured by what was being built, trying to get the highest yield from development sites. So it's certainly part of the conversation. It wasn't the focus of the survey.
Oh, wait, is there any?
Oh, that's right.
Sorry. If you could have this. It's from Jane Partridge. They've said, interested to know if you'd speculate how the results may have differed had you obtained feedback from investors rather than owner-occupiers.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we did capture a smaller subset of investors. It wasn't what we focused on for the reporting, but we did. There were some other things that came up. So things around purchasing a unit that was well located, that had good services, was still shared by owner-occupiers and investor owners because they wanted to capture a good rental market. So a well located, good location, well set out apartment, something that was quality, was what was expressed by investor owners as well. So those preferences of owner-occupiers are still coming across. From what we were able to collect, there were some more, I guess, things that we would draw out a little bit further, but it wasn't part of the reporting that we did. In the main, those preferences were quite universal.
Yeah, Rich, this is my name. Can I ask a question about governance? That also includes the changes to the strata laws that permit people, a group of apartments to get control over the entire thing and then demand that remaining apartment owners sell their stake and then redevelop the site. Because that's a fairly recent change in the strata law.
It is, yeah. So it's something that I'm working on with colleagues here on another project. Collective sales and apartment renewal. In this survey, there were some things about aging apartments and considering what to do with those apartments. I don't recall any specific comments about people feeling like they were being ganged up on or pushed out or anything like that. But it's certainly something that we're aware of doing research in the apartment sector.
Yeah, I'm referring to loss of agency. You can be forced out of your home when you don't want to move.
Yeah, it was more smaller disputes. So, people learning the ropes, I guess you'd say, of being part of a strata committee, being part of the scheme, learning how levies worked. less so about loss of home.
Might just jump in with
Yeah.
with a plug here. So we did a research project along with Bill Randolph, who's online, back in 2015 called Renewing the Compact City, which focused specifically on that topic. So if you're interested, please read those reports.
We have another online question. It's from Gavin Alford. It says, apology if I missed it. Were the survey responders concentrated in particular locations?
They were, and for your benefit, I will go back to the slide. So most of the surveyed owner-occupiers that we captured lived in Greater Sydney, specifically in the Eastern City and North districts. So we used the New South Wales planning districts as a way, as a recognised way for the department to break up geography. We did capture, so 13% was in outside of Greater Sydney. So we did capture some responses from regional centres, so Newcastle, Wollongong, the Central Coast, and also some other regional New South Wales, so sort of North Coast as well.
And also, Gavin, that broadly aligned with the spread of apartments across the state as well.
Yeah, so this is where apartments are. So the sample was representative, which was good.
We have two. One from Maida again. Do you know the investors are using any kind of digital platforms to collect the occupiers' feedback in case of their preferences?
Not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. There were, I think, something else. We saw that the owner occupiers that we captured were highly informed and discerning consumers. We captured some investor owners who had a portfolio of properties. I'd say that maybe some of them might be using technology to assist in that, but otherwise I'm not sure I can answer that question.
There's follow-up. Gavin's got a follow-up to the earlier question about the concentration in locations. They've asked if do you think that this would influence the results in any way? So there's more questions coming through.
Ali, I think Gavin's question was about whether the spread of survey responses was biased, and I think I may have answered that.
Oh, you did?
My follow-up. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay.
Yeah.
And other questions from Jane. Jane Partridge saying, did you give UNSW recommendations such as about communication, awareness raising, educating strata owners / purchasers?
Yeah, so the government architect were a really involved client throughout the process. So they were engaged with the research that we were doing. The closing reflections that I presented, you'll see in the final report that there are some closing reflections, a couple of which are broadly speaking to the sector and the engagement and the education piece for owners. So that is part of this. It's not under the remit of government architect, but there are broader considerations to be had for the apartment sector around what we can do to make things straightforward, understandable for owners at both the consumer side and the market side.
I was actually interested about that shortfall thing. That was quite interesting that people didn't always get what they wanted. So I was sort of wondering whether do you actually find that there's like a bigger premium on the price for the ones with the bigger shortfall? Is that related, or were you not able to get those financial information in the process?
Yeah, we didn't ask purchase price by how much things costed. That would be quite interesting. And I mean, people usually balk at a question about how much money you spent in a survey, so it's not always a successful question. But yeah, it would be something quite interesting to follow up with that, if there is something about shortfall and scarcity and the market's responding to that scarcity, then yeah, there's maybe an interesting dynamic we could pull out further.
You may have covered this, but I was managing the chat room.
No.
I was wondering, because you said you interviewed some people aged 19 to 30, like the age range. I was wondering what if you noticed any differences in responses per age.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I'm I'm interested myself in sort of the first home buyer generation rent story. So I was very glad to see that there was a nice spread of the age of the owners that we got for the survey. So I was able here to interview 6 owners between the age of 19 and 34. For the majority of those people, that was their first purchase. So I was able to speak to them about, the first home buyer experience as well as the experience of buying into an apartment for the first time. In terms of differences between age cohorts, in terms of things like needs, what people were looking for, what people prioritized. So, things like accessibility were seen as more important for people that were older, so the older cohorts. Access to services, access to transport. I had a couple of people that in the 19 to 34 cohort that were thinking about the next step, and a couple of people that were really focused on raising their children in an apartment, that this was where they were going to stay. So one of the things that we really wanted to do with the interviews was capture a diversity and variety of responses, and age was certainly something that I was really keen to get a nice spread of.
Any more questions online?
Okay. Well, look, it's about coming up at 5 o'clock, so I'd like to thank Charlie very much for his presentation today. Just as a reminder, we run the seminar every 2 weeks, and the next seminar we're going to have will be on the 5th of April, when Peter Poulet and Hannah Billetto will be talking about the City Institute. But meanwhile, I do want to thank Charlie again very much for the very interesting talk.